Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
All right, welcome everybody. We'll call this informational meeting to order for Tuesday, October 29th, and we will begin with City Council open discussion. Anybody? Councilor Staley?
I wanted to just bring up a request that I had concerning the discussion we've been hearing, not necessarily out in the public yet, but there's been a discussion about changing our meeting time from 7 to 6. And so in doing so, of course, then we have all sorts of concerns about what we do with this 4 o'clock time right now. And as long as this is televised, I'm going to just give this the citizens a little briefing about this 4 o'clock informational time. Happens every week, even on the weeks we don't have a meeting, like tonight. But this is a time that's very important for many of us to get information from the city. They bring forth different policies and projects that are going to be happening. And we get a chance to ask questions about how this is going to affect the citizens. And the citizens have a chance to hear the dialogue and to hear the answers. Sometimes these meetings can take up to 2 hours. And I know I don't have any problem with that. I'm happy to get as much, or to commit as much time as needed to get the answers for our people. Then after that, frequently we have what we call an executive session. And that's where we go into a special meeting with our attorney. And those have been taking maybe 25 to a half an hour worth of time. So if we would move forward now or whenever with a change in our times from our regular meeting from the 7 o'clock to the 6 o'clock time, it's going to cause the council to have to sit back and decide how we're going to make up this hour right now. How we're going to have time to fit in time to eat, time for the technology to reset, that takes a half hour. And there's talk about moving our meeting to this meeting now that's at 4 o'clock to 3 o'clock. There's talk about moving it to a different day. I know many of us have work commitments, so we've already got our schedule set on these other days of the week. And the benefit of moving it, which was brought forth by the mayor's office, suggested by TJ Nelson and the mayor, would be that, first of all, the media apparently has indicated that they would like it to be over earlier. And then people could get home earlier from the meeting, at this 7 o'clock meeting, which those two, to me, are not, that doesn't carry enough weight to make this huge change that's going to have a domino effect onto the rest of this day. So I having had this conversation with several of my colleagues this week, and I reached out to TJ Nelson and told him this afternoon and said, TJ, I'm going to ask that you come in and do an informational so we can have a discussion within this group as to how we're going to handle the mechanics of our city council meetings if indeed they do bring this forward to make the official meeting an hour earlier. Another thing, if we started our meetings at 6 o'clock, we would be in direct competition with the 6 o'clock news. And part of what I've been doing on the council for 3.5 years is encouraging people to watch the 7 o'clock meeting, get more people involved. So now, if we move it to 6, we're going to have the citizens having to make a decision whether they watch the weather, sports, breaking news, or watch our city council meeting. So TJ Nelson, I did tell him that I was going to request that he come in and do it at informational if and when he wants to bring this forward. He then indicated to me that he was going to drop it. And today they made a decision. They were going to put it on hold. And so I said, please send us that in an email so we know that it's not coming around the corner. So right now, I'm not sure how this is going to play out, but I would still think it would be good to have some kind of a discussion, and we're kind of limited as to how we can talk about these things. Counselor Neisert, I'm just talking about my request to TJ Nelson today that he come in and do an informational about that time change, so that we could have a dialogue, openly within the council about that. So I just wanted to say that that's what I've said. We have yet to see how they're going to respond to us or where that's at. Maybe some of you have already gotten some information from him that is, so, yeah. So we don't really know.
Okay.
So that would be my request, is that we still could be looking at this, because it was brought up earlier, it was brought up again this week. If it gets brought up in 3 months, I think we need to have the discussion as how we're going to sustain the quality and quantity of this informational time for the council.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Erickson.
I would just echo that having a working session or an informational or something like that, certainly see no harm in that the council meeting is 8 council members and the mayor administration. And so ironing out some of the details as far as, not being rushed. I certainly don't want to see the 4 o'clock meeting moved any earlier, because so many of us, I wouldn't be able to get my children from school then, and that's a big deal for me and other parents. And so, but having that conversation certainly is worthwhile. And so if it's something we want to just add on, and whether or not anyone else wants to participate, we can talk about it freely without having it become all of a sudden a pseudo presentation on our agenda. And so the next time we have 5-10 minutes to just talk about it amongst ourselves, just to iron out some of those details that, when we come here at 4 o'clock, oftentimes I'm here at 3 or 3:30, and then to be able to eat, which sounds really silly, but that time in between, if we even have 45 minutes or an hour for some of us to meet and go have dinner, is well worth the collaboration and relationship building for us amongst ourselves to do that in small groups, and so on and so forth. So I don't see any hurt in doing that in the future, and when the schedule is lined up, let's do it. So, okay. And then I have one more thing to add, if I can.
Yep.
The other item for open discussion I'd like to add is this last Thursday night was the sleep out at the Bishop Dudley House, where we stayed in a tent. I know many of us have done that in the past, as well as city leaders, as well as the media, and so on and so forth. We had representatives from Kello, developers, people within the Catholic Diocese, county commissioners, as well as city councilors, a police officer, and it was a really good dialogue. I had done it once before in the past and was asked to do it again. What I found different this time is it was a really collaborative effort for many of us to really just kind of shoot around the table some of the issues that we see in lieu of some of the maybe negative press that has come out about that neighborhood, and how we can work together to solve some of those issues and not point fingers at any one person, but really talk about it as a big conversation. Gene Bender, County Commissioner, was there, as well as Marshall Selberg and myself, and others. Like I said, it's always really, really eye-opening and humbling. This year we heard a story about an actual employee who was homeless and really, really struggled, and her testimony and her story, I think, changed every single one of us in that room to see how big of a fighter she is. And now she's there working and giving back and treating these folks with dignity in a situation that most of them didn't ask for, but are trying to get out of. And so it's a big fundraiser for them, but on top of that, it really promotes a lot of awareness for our homeless community and the good work that the Bishop Dudley does do. So just wanted to toss that out there. That was last week, and it was cold. It was way colder than I'd ever done it in the past. And for me, it's a humbling experience, because I get to go home to my warm house when most of these people are then trying to figure out how they're going to stay awake at work and make ends meet and get their kids to school and where their next meal is coming from. So it's a really humbling time. One of their big challenges that they have is getting these people to job interviews. The county does give them free bus passes. For me personally, I would love to see us as a city try to partner with them by allowing some additional bus rides to job interviews to get these people back into society and getting them a job that they can then become part of a situation that maybe they don't want to be in. And so if that's an option, I would love for us to be able to look at that. I know Lyft just announced a effort on their app this last week of free rides for folks that are going to job interviews to get people back into the workforce. And so that was kind of cool to see a partner like Lyft do something like that in the community. However, let's be honest, not everybody has a smartphone, and not everyone can just call up Lyft to do that. And so if we can partner with them to getting them to those job interviews and getting them what they need, I think that's a good option for us, instead of just giving them to the county, who then gives them back to the Bishop Deadly. So that's really it. So thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, I would just add on the sleep out on Thursday, it was, awareness-wise, how would you put it? You wouldn't say you enjoyed it, but it certainly was eye-opening, and I learned quite a bit. And it's nice to see Madeline Shields in that position over there and her staff, and they're doing a great job. And as Councilor Erickson said, one of them shared her story, and it was pretty powerful. But they're doing a really nice job there. And I couldn't help but think, as we're sleeping out there, and it was cold, but I was expecting the worst, and it wasn't so terrible. But I was also thinking throughout the night, we were at least under a tent and kind of protected, and there was an officer that was sleeping next to us too, so I think she was ready. So you kind of felt kind of safe there, and I was like, well, you get kind of an idea, but what are these people doing that don't even have the tent and are sleeping under the bridge? And I don't know. Again, the awareness part of it is something that I certainly took away from it, but it was quite an experience. So, anywho, we'll move on to presentations for this week. And our first one is with Director Pritchett with the September 2019 financials. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Sean Pritchett with the Department of Finance. I'm going to walk through the September financial report here. And as we do in previous months, kind of take a look at some of those general economic trends that we see occurring here in the community. And no major material changes here in terms of the economic outlooks that we've seen. Unemployment continues to be very strong. We're still sitting at 2.4%. That's a slight uptick from where we had seen previously, but certainly in line with our trending for the year, and still well below the national average of 3.8%. Labor force and employment also, we've seen a slight drop in September, or the August numbers, but again, continues that trend where we're growing at about 2% annually in terms of our employment base in the community. Inflation also continues to remain very low. It's at 1.7% for the month. And that continues a pattern driven a lot by the energy sector, which has been negative for the last 5 months and 8 of the last months in 2019. So that has driven a lot and kept the inflation factors in check overall. So no material changes in respect to all of those. I want to talk a little bit about building permit numbers. Again, nothing significantly surprising here. We are trailing where we were 2 years ago slightly, and we're a little bit further behind where we were in 2018. Through September, we are currently at about $542 million permits issued. Driven in part, new residential values, they are down about 10% from where they were in 2017 and about 6% down from where they were in September of 2018. The biggest driver of this, of course, is multifamily units. This is something that we've seen continuing throughout the year. But we had total permits issued through September, and there weren't any in September, actually. So we're at $41 million of permits issued. It's about half of where we were in the last 2 years for multifamily housing. So we are seeing correction in that. The other one that you see some significant lower numbers coming in is manufacturing. This area doesn't actually comprise a very large portion of the permits we issued. We were at $8.8 million through September of 2019, but that is still down significantly from the $26 million we were at 2 years ago. The one area where we're seeing real positive movement is in other commercial, so this would include things like strip malls, hotels, and restaurants. We're actually up about $40 million this year in that category, about 60% up over where we had been last year. Looking again at housing a little bit further, you can again see the separation of the multifamily housing numbers, and this is number of permits issued versus single family and duplex over the last 4 years. So we've had 487 single family housing units issued, 417 multifamily, and 284 townhome housing units issued. On the multifamily side, again, we're about 50% down on the permit side. So that 487 units, that compares to 2019, and that's in 2019. This compares to 2017, where we had about 878. And you can see in that line for 2016 year, where we had a record year, we were well over 1,300 units issued during this time of year. So we are significantly down from that. But that's been an expected correction within the multifamily sector based on the number of units that have been built in the last several years. On the housing side, we're staying new on the single family and the townhomes. We are down slightly, but we're staying fairly steady with where we were last year. On the sales tax collections for the city, there's positive news here in this front. So we had another strong month in the month of September, growing about 8.1% over where we were in September of 2018. Our rolling average, that figure that we look most closely at and tracking where our sales tax receipts are going, that actually went up from 5% last month to 5.5%. So we're having strong momentum going there. We'll be watching the last 3 months closely here as we start nearing toward the end of the year. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in a couple of slides as we project out toward the end of the year here. Entertainment tax collections actually came in lower. We had negative growth in September 2019 versus September 2018, but we had really strong growth in that year. We had 13% growth in September, so it makes it a little bit more challenging to overcome that kind of growth on a month-to-month comparison basis. We had negative growth in September or October of last year, so there's a possibility we may see some rebounding here on the entertainment tax, but with the lower receipts that we've seen come in over the last several months, that has taken down our 12-month rolling average to 4.4%. So we'll continue to monitor that. This is just typically a more a variable source, and so, but like I said, we'll continue to monitor those entertainment taxes, especially as we near into the end of the year. As far as the total revenues that we have so far through the year, we're about 69% collected on what our budgeted expectations were. This mirrors where we were last year, where we were also 69% collected. Overall, so very, very comparable for where we've been in the last few years. If you look at page 1 in your financial report, and gives more detailed information, property taxes are about 55% of budget. That compares to 57% last year, but very comparative to where we were the last year before. So we're lagging a little bit there, but nothing significant that's giving any concern. And as we talked about previously, the bank franchise fees are coming in significantly more than what we had anticipated. And of course, based on the 2 slides ago that we referenced, our sales taxes are coming in fairly strong as well. We're about 78% of our budget expectations on the sales tax, and that compares favorably with where we were last year, exactly at the same rate. And as you recall, last year we brought in more sales taxes than we had originally anticipated also. On the expenditure side, same story to tell here. We are about 69% expended on our general fund dollars. This is very much the same as where we were last year at this time, and that we're about 75% through the year. Most of the departments look to be in good shape in terms of where they're at on their budget. The one that we're watching the most closely here is highways and streets, and that's going to be a discussion here in the next presentation when we talk about supplemental. We've talked about this a lot over the last several months, just based on the winter conditions that we had that drove a lot of those snow removal expenses. So I'm gonna kind of punt a little bit on talking more about that until the next presentation following this one, where we talk about the supplementals. The last slide here is new for this month, and this is that time of year when we kind of take a look at where we're going to end up for the end of the year. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about this particular slide. The information on the left, that's our original budget that was approved by you. So as we walk through that, very quickly, we projected revenues of $165 million and expenditures of about $169 million. We budgeted for $3.7 million use of reserves. However, we typically turn back 2 to 3% of our budget. I believe we estimated a 2% turn back in the projection of the general fund. So we estimated $3.4 million would go unspent, and that we would end up with a remaining available balance of about $51.7 million. So Net, that results in use of reserves of about $300,000, and that was the budget that had been approved. Our current budget is showing off to the right. There was a couple of supplements that you did already approve for this year. They include $132,000 for a police grant, and the other more larger one was $600,000 that was allocated as a result of the spring flooding for Parks and Rec and for some of the recovery efforts there. So that particular budget on the revenue and expense side accounts for those adjusted changes. What you also see is we've made some additional projections there. So at this time, we're projecting about 1.8 million of the budget authority to be unspent. And this is before the additional supplementals that we'll be talking about in the next presentation in terms of that number. And then we do have projected revenue over budget that we're projecting at this time of about $3.1 million. Now, how we get to that, essentially we're assuming that we'll probably end the year sales tax growth of about 6%. And that assumes that we grow about 5% for the last 3 months of the year. Even if we don't make that, if we didn't grow at all in terms of our sales taxes, it's not going to shave a lot off of this projection, probably about $800,000, so it's not material. But if you look at our revenue forecast there, right now we're projecting about $1 million being added to reserves if everything holds constant. But this is all subject to a variety of factors. Number one, how many snow events we have through the end of the year, as well as how much we get for FEMA reimbursements in this particular year. We're in the process of submitting from the spring flood, and many of those dollars are starting to come in, but it'll just depend on which year we actually take those numbers in. The other things on the revenues coming in over expectations that I wanted to highlight, we did have 6 additional liquor licenses that we sold, so that generated about another $1 million. The bank franchise fees, we did talk about that. Building permits about $400,000 more than we had anticipated. On the health charges side, actually, we're about 1.7 million low on revenues. That's driven by a couple of vacancies that we've had. So there's a revenue and expense effect to that. So even though we're about 1.7 short on our expectations for revenues, that does drive our expenses down as well. If you approve the supplementals that will be coming forward in the next couple of weeks, first 2 weeks of November, that is going to adjust that current budget a little bit, but what I will tell you is it doesn't adjust our available fund balance at the end of the day. So it will adjust that projected unspent budget. It'll increase that. It will equally increase the expenditures. But the message that I wanted to leave here is that we've incorporated the impact of those supplemental requests into this projection already for the most part. The main factors, variables right now is going to be the number of snow events and how much FEMA reimbursement we take in this year, which can affect that going forward. With that, I'd answer any questions you have related to the September financials.
All right, thank you. Councilors, any questions? Councilor Neitzer?
There was an article in the newspaper about internet sales tax. Do we have concrete data? I don't know. Does the state give us anything that's granular enough where we know that we can say that we're getting more from internet sales tax and it's going to be a structural, permanent change, or where do you stand on that?
With our conversations from the state, they have released some remote sellers information on a statewide basis that they've aggregated. You know, up to this time, they've struggled and they continue to struggle a little bit of how you discern what's a remote seller versus a non-remote seller. You've had some remote sellers that have added physical locations in our state, so which way do you count that? Those that might have exited our state, and how would you count that? So that's been the challenge for them. I think some people have looked at some of the numbers. There's a line item within the state's numbers that they have by city that talks about catalog sales, and the state has stated that a lot of what they anticipate for remote sellers is being categorized there, but it's not everything. Some of it is still being categorized in under other subcategories. What they've told us is they're hoping they'll have a city-by-city accounting of some of that remote seller data by next month. So I'm hoping that maybe we come back in 3 weeks for an October report that we might have a little bit more granular data that we can rely on from that. If we just look at that category, you know, there is some positive news from Sioux Falls. We've seen some growth there. It isn't driving the entirety of our growth. I think we're hitting our budgeted expectations without that, but it is certainly having a positive impact within the city of Sioux Falls. And the net, you know, response or the way we look at it is preserving our taxable base. So, you know, as changes of consumer preferences occur and they may begin to be expending funds online versus at physical locations within the community. Those are still sales that are occurring within our community, and so it's preserving that tax base for us. So it's a positive thing for Sioux Falls, and I think the data right now would support that it's maybe been a little bit more positive for Sioux Falls than in other parts of the state.
Okay, thank you.
Counselor Staley?
Excuse me, I got a cough drop here. Just a side note, you're talking about, of course, sales tax collections. Tonight, the Cosmopolitan Club is honoring the queen of the second penny. Did you know that? Loila Hunking. You ever-
Didn't until I had a conversation with Councilor Starr before the meeting.
Yes, so that, and how many, Counselor Starr, how long ago was that came in? I mean, before you were born, I believe.
Not that long.
1950s. But no, it was maybe 70s or something like that. But anyway, so that's, thanks to her. As Counselor Starr said earlier today, well, just think of where we'd be if we didn't have that second penny.
It is certainly a dramatic impact for our community.
So let's go back to slide 6, please. I thought it was interesting, you used the word correction on the multifamily homes that you're talking about from 17 to 19. Well, actually, you went back to the September of 2016, and you said we've made a correction. Now here's my question, Sean. Apartment builders, developers are not stupid, and I don't believe they have certain tools they use to project what they're going to need for their occupancy. Would you agree with that?
Well, they certainly in their pro formas, they have to hit certain occupancy ratios to meet those, what they did for their financing or their investors.
Well, so they've got their eye on the mark, on the potential tenants in our community. Now, we were told, and we have been told through the time I've been on the council, and even before that, that our city is growing approximately 5,000 citizens a year. Have you heard that number?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you exactly that amount.
And that number, I believe that was equated into the rationale for building the $260 million waste treatment facility, because we're continuing to use that 5,000 number and multiplying it times 10 or whatever to get to the 120 extra citizens we're going to have in 20 years. So my question is, if they're not, it looks like they're not building as many apartments anymore.
Well, if you look back at the population data, I mean, it's been very, the trend has been very steady, okay? If you look at what we historically have added for multifamily units in this community, that's based on that existing trend line, it's, I believe, more in that 700 to 800 unit range. Well, if you look at 2016, we were adding far more units, and this is just through September. This doesn't count the last 3 months of the year. So we were adding significantly more than what our trend had been. Now, there's some preferential changes that maybe people were more likely to be renters and owning homes coming out of the 2008 recession. Millennials are maybe more likely to rent versus buy, so maybe that drove some of that increased anticipation of rental units. But, and I think I don't have the data in front of me, but I think there was several years leading up to this where we were well over that kind of where we'd been historically. So when I say correction, it's because, you know, in 17 and 18, we kind of got back to what was normal for us. We may be a little bit lower on the end for this year, but a couple factors, you know, demand is not the only factor that occurs here. The other factor is construction costs and whether they can make it financially viable based on existing construction costs. And we know that construction costs have been fairly high right now. We may see some correction of that going forward as well, but all those are factors at play. I wouldn't extrapolate from this that this is a change in our projected growth for the city of Sioux Falls, because I think we had an overabundance of supply for a certain period that we are now absorbing currently.
So you're saying in 2016, you think all of those multifamily units weren't, when it comes to 2017, then they say, hey, we got a lot of vacancies here, so.
The market corrects itself.
I mean,
you often see times of undersupply in multifamily, and then you see it rebuild and they oversupply. And multifamily has kind of been on that top end of that it's in that oversupply market because we've built up so much over family. And the vacancy rates, I think, would generally support that. You know, it varies by the type of facility you have, but
Yeah, and I don't know what the vacancy rates are, but my question always has been, and I mean, I'm seeing, there's a lot of apartments in our community. So I'm thinking to myself, gee, are these at maximum capacity? Apparently they're not, because they're not building as many.
well, and there's some timing issues too, because I think there are several that potentially haven't been permitted yet that will probably hit this year. Again, I don't think we're going to hit the numbers that we've hit 4 years ago, but I think those were times where we had overinflated building going on in the multifamily sector.
Well, and it'd be interesting to know if we have, and we don't really, I don't think we can track this, but how many people are buying new homes? You know, in are people going to a home? The availability of a house priced under 185,000 is really scarce. So
Yeah, I don't know on the demand side, you know, in terms of the buyers, I would say what is a consideration or concern, and, you know, we talked about this in the previous financial report, is the uptick we have seen in that kind of, the median price of a home in Sioux Falls has increased significantly
yes,
over the
yes.
last several years in affordability on. And part of that, again, goes to what is the viability from a construction standpoint of building a new home in that affordable price range. And if you're dealing with inflated construction costs and infrastructure costs, land prices, so on and so forth, it is making it more challenging for developers to develop in that lowest cost range of the $150,000, $175,000 home.
But I would think moving, as we continue to grow, would think that number on those apartments would be going up instead of coming down. That's just my rationale looking at that. So I hear you saying that's not the way it is, but we'll have
I'd
to.
get concerned if we were probably 4 or 5 years out, but I do think we're in an absorption stage right now where we're absorbing units that have already been built.
Okay,
that
okay,
were in
good.
excess. I don't think it's indicative of a change in our
Okay.
population trending.
And then I've got another question. We just saw that Kristi Noem, our governor, is asking for federal help in this tornado activity. So the question I had throughout that whole time after the tornado, and that people were asking is, you know, what is the city going to be doing for the citizens to help with the cleanup? And I heard a lot from our mayor that it was a volunteer effort. And I think that we were cutting costs in that aspect to have the volunteer groups coming forth, and some of us even went out and helped. So the FEMA element, I didn't quite understand, or I guess I'm going to ask this. How much did the tornado cost the city of Sioux Falls? How much did we pay out of, over and above what we?
We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next presentation, so I don't want to get too much into that because we're going to talk about that. We have a supplemental
About specifically the tornado?
Specifically on the tornado event. But in kind of in the line of what you're talking about, you know, there is we're looking, I think we're going to be seeking reimbursement for our expenses relative to that, but we have to keep in mind FEMA is reimbursing us for expenses related to the loss of public infrastructure or dealing with the public safety type of issues. So like the flooding event that occurred earlier in the spring, the city can't seek reimbursement for a loss of on somebody's private property if it's their private property. The city seeks reimbursement for its costs that it incurs related to the loss of public infrastructure or mitigating the damages that occurred.
Okay, so case in point, I was contacted by a woman who has a business off 41st Street, and she was not in the tornado, her property, but south of her it was. And fire trucks drove over her boulevard into her parking area. They went over the boulevard. They made huge trenches in her boulevard grass, which I have photos of, and that cracked her sidewalk. And so she reached out to me because she had asked the city to at least to fix the sidewalk. And then she was told that if it's in the midst of a disaster, the city has no responsibility. Her insurance company said it's the city's responsibility. So she's going to be left to repair that sidewalk. And actually, the fire trucks drove over her property in several different areas. I encouraged her to come forth and say something to ask that the city would, you know, just take care of her sidewalk. So I would think if we're getting some FEMA reimbursement, isn't infrastructure that way? Wouldn't that be included in it?
There's some inclusion. I guess this isn't really my area of expertise in the particulars of that. I would suggest that you maybe reach out to Regan Smith, who is here, back here, and he maybe be able to provide you some feedback or to talk to risk management about those particular items. I'm not sure if they're aware of those particular ones, so I think that might be just a
Amen.
conversation you may
Okay,
wanna have with
yes,
them.
all right, thank you.
Any other questions? Counselor Starr?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. You give me something new and I'm excited about it, but of course I'll ask for more then. You gave us a great year-end projections for the general fund. Where are we sitting in projections as we go forward for the capital fund?
You know, I'd have to describe that. You know, we're probably, I'm gonna speak very broadly here. So
Please.
it's a little bit challenging because we have to look at where we're at with the projects and so forth. What we can estimate is that sales taxes are coming in significantly higher than what we had originally anticipated. So there is an expectation we will have a surplus coming in, but it's too early to be able to tell you exactly what that number is going to be yet.
Perfect. One of the other things, you know, trying to follow, let's say it this way, our financials as a city look significantly better than what our state government is doing. When you saw some of the presentations that were done and at least the media reports of them, how do we compare? Would you make that same assessment that we're in a lot better shape than, it's asking you to predict the future, which I know is uncomfortable, but there are those that do that, and that's part of that process. Do we see the farm situation continuing to not affect us as a city as much as it does the state, or are we starting to plan for some of those slowdowns that the state is starting to see overall?
You know, we're definitely not immune to those effects, but I think it's fair to say that we're not as impacted as they are. I mean, if you look at the diversification of our economy relative to the diversification, how reliant upon our state is, the number of acres that didn't get planted this year, that is going to have significant impact, I think, especially in small rural towns that do not have diverse economies and are highly reliant upon the ag sector. Are we going to see some impact here? Yes, it's hard to tell because we're kind of in a positive standpoint. So it's like, how much more growth would we have had if the ag economy was better? You know, I still believe that the ag economy carried Sioux Falls through the last major recession. I absolutely believe because of the strength of that, we were able to be immune to many of the effects that we saw going on nationally. So if that's the effect, I'd have to think that there's a counter effect here that we would be performing even more strong if it wasn't for the impact of the ag economy right now.
Yeah. And the one other thing is on slide 7, if you can slide back, it's the sales tax collections. The rolling number helps us get an idea of where we're headed, but with the actual collections, you know, with some of those drops during the summer that we see, how much of that falls between that 9 and 11% growth compared to, did we have really strong numbers in, I guess when I go back to 18, it doesn't look a little bit better through those months in comparison. So was it as much that collections were a little bit slower and people paid their sales tax bills on time, and was it remitted at different times, or is that 5.5% kind of really where we're at as a rolling number? Because when you see 11 in August and you see 8.1 in September, it almost feels like we're in better shape than 5.5%.
You know, and if you look at our number from last year, it was 4.5% in December, so the full calendar year. So you can see we probably made a 1% bump. But, you know, if we're feeling a little better than where we were, part of that may be, you know, some of that counteractive effects of the ag economy and the impacts that it has on us. And one of those areas is we'd have to watch is entertainment tax collections. And is that affecting people coming to Sioux Falls and for entertainment purposes, whether it's buying tickets or going to restaurants or just staying overnight in some of our hotels and shopping. So, like I said, it's a little too early for us to tell that impact. It certainly is having some impact there. I think, you know, as I said, we're believing we're going to get to 6% for the year, which would be about a 1.5% increase over 2018, which would be a fairly significant jump.
Can you flip back to or flip forward, I guess, to slide 8 for the entertainment tax collections? Can you take this chart and equate it to the number of performances at the Denny, or it's tough to see, is there a soccer tournament in town? I mean, it's so hard to take that entertainment money and say, okay, where what's making the jumps? I'm betting that the month Garth Brooks was in town, I bet we could pick that out in comparison to.
You know, with the Garth Brooks concert where you had 9 concerts, it's going to have some sort of impact. But I think it is muted by the fact that we're talking about all alcohol sales, all lodging sales, all restaurant sales are getting being a part of this tax. And so, you know, tickets are just an important but a much smaller component. I just don't know that that's necessarily going to be a huge driver of whether we're going up or down. It's probably going to have some impact in that regard. But, you know, if you look at lodging, it's almost, you know, we looked at some of the bid tax information for the last couple of years, and it is almost identical for the last 4 years. I mean, the seasonality is almost like perfect. And so from a lodging perspective, you would see a lot of continuity there. So I would say the variability has to be in maybe some of those restaurant sales, and maybe it's in the ticketing side. But we're entering that time period where lodging is low, and so we're not going to see those collections coming in on the lodging side.
No, and when you look at occupancy separate from the sales tax collection, you see that. So, I mean, we've added, you know, a number of hotel rooms too. So trying to compare occupancy to the actual revenue generated through some of those things has got to be a little bit tougher to see. The one other place that I wanted to hit is the other major building project. One of the major capital building projects that we've done or that we have open right now is the parking ramp, and getting a feel for where are we at in that process? What do we have for funds that are still available? How much has been expended, and kind of an update of where we're at with that financially.
If you go to, so if we turn to, this would be page 7 of the monthly financial report. So you're going to have it's not going to be the 7th page, but it'll be the one labeled 7th. So this is going to show our enterprise funds. So public parking is one of our enterprise funds. And I'd point you to the bottom of that. So it's showing available cash and cash equivalents. And that's showing at about just shy of $3 million right now. Now, there's a couple of factors you got to take into account with that. We have some funds from the bond draw that we're still waiting. We've paid for in cash. We're drawing back down from the bonds to reimburse since we're still in a mid-construction phase. We have a bond payment that needs to be made in November. That's included in that cash. We expect we'll have some additional revenue generation before the end of the year through the parking fund. So, you know, net, our projection would be, you know, at this point, slightly ahead of $2 million is that balance at year end.
What do we have left then for expenditures to finishing up the ramp? Because we're still, I'm assuming that we're still on for the June completion and to start generating more revenue from opening the facility and doing those things. So how much of that of the $2 million do we expect to still owe as the construction continues?
Well, there's still a lot of bond funds that are not accounted for on here. So that they aren't necessarily drawn out of the bond account where they're sitting at, so they wouldn't appear within the enterprise fund. So I don't have that information off the top of my head right now because we have several pay requests that are still under review with Public Works that are still being paid. So I don't know off the top of my head what that number looks like. You're always a little behind in paying, even though you look like you're further along in construction. So they're still reviewing a lot of those. It takes time to bill all that out.
So then is it possible to get an accounting of the bond account of what's gone in and out and getting us a copy of that to just kind of give us an idea of where we're at? Because I think we're anticipating some change orders coming shortly, or at least when Matt was here during the budget hearings, he said that he would get us updated numbers for some changes. The doorways to nowhere, I think is how he described it, and that we were 2 to 3 weeks out from actually having some of that information. So I guess I'm curious of what it's going to take to close it up, and if we're in that point where we're ready to see those change orders, or if those will be coming through on our agenda shortly.
Yeah, I definitely think we can get that put together and provide that summary.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councilor Erickson.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that Councilor Neitzer was talking about is the internet sales, and it sparked and I don't remember when it is, but I know it will have a financial impact to every single municipality when we lose the sales tax on internet charges, not internet purchases, but on the actual service of internet. When does that take effect again? I don't remember.
It takes effect June of next year.
Okay,
In fact,
so we've got some
the governor
time.
speaking about it. They're anticipated. I'm trying to recall what they felt like the loss was very significant for the state.
I
It
know
was
we're,
10 million plus, I believe, that the state was going to be losing, they believed. And excuse me, I didn't have it off the top of my head. That will have some impact of that, and we tried to incorporate that into the projections we had
and I've
for next
seen it
year.
before, I just forgot the date on it. So thank you for that. The other thing that I want to talk about, and I know it's no surprise to you what I'm going to bring up because I have been talking to you as well as our financial analyst as well. We've been hearing a lot about entertainment venues, so to speak, and collectibles. And so I personally, and I've talked to a few council members about this as well, that for our next month, I would like to see something in more detail about this. For example, we've made some changes with the pavilion moving over to, the pavilion taking over the Orpheum. What happened to all of those debts? There was an article in the newspaper about one of the tenants being debt-free, which I know is not true. And so what does that mean? And I know I've asked you about it. I know I've clarified with the person that wrote that article, and they did do a correction for that. Because the debt doesn't mysteriously disappear, so to speak, for these tenants that choose to not pay, whether it's someone having a wedding at the convention center, or whether it's a huge event and they host a private event, whatever it is, you still have to pay, obviously, your bill for that. And so for me, really, I want to say this carefully, it's really a subsidy. If we're just forgiving this debt, it's a subsidy, in my opinion, that we're just saying, oh, let's go ahead, just bypass the city council and we're going to forgive your debt. I don't care if you owe 100 grand or 10 grand, it's a subsidy. And for me personally, we're here to vote on those budgetary processes that I don't want to just see a write-off willy-nilly, so to speak. So I'd like to know the process for that, maybe talk about what's outstanding for those. And I have already reached out to the GM for SMG. I've talked to Darren Smith. I have not reached out to the golf, and I'm guessing they probably don't have a whole lot sitting there at this point. I don't know how many times that's rented for a private facility or whatever it might be. And their collectibles are probably much smaller versus someone who has a convention for that. So I'd like to see kind of the process with that. And then I'm also curious, I don't know how, and the stadium I would include in there because we've talked a lot about the stadium. We as a council have talked a lot about the stadium where we've kind of robbed Peter to pay Paul to make some of these nonprofits whole because we didn't want to invest a bunch of money into a facility that we didn't know if we wanted to keep the doors open, so to speak. So I would include those four if we can and just kind of talk about those third-party collectibles, the policy. And then what happens when they say, well, we're going to say throw it off to collections. We've also talked about this with people using the landfill, and they've been essentially blacklisted from the landfill to where until they pay their debt, they can't use, I mean, I don't know if that's too strong to say blacklisted, but we've had problems with garbage haulers as well. And so I just, for me personally, I've just seen so much about it in the media lately that I just kind of want to clean this up and get the right information out there. I don't know that I'm asking for it to be publicized for everyone because I know they don't have to do that, but I'd like to know their policy as far as that goes forward. The other thing that I'm curious about as I sit here and ramble, I apologize, but for those four agreements that we have, do we have an option for our audit to come in and say, we want to audit your collectibles, we want to audit that process? Because that might just be a good thing for our audit division to come in and do. I have not talked about this with Shauna or Greg or anybody. It just, as I'm sitting here going, I wonder if that's something that we can do, to have Shauna's team come in and look at something like that. So in a nutshell, that's what I'd like to see, if we can do that for next month and just add it to the financial, maybe a few slides, or if you want to do a standalone presentation on that, invite those GMs in. They do know that it's something that I've been poking around at as well as our staff. So if there's anything we can do with that, my concern is just kind of backdooring the system for a subsidy, so to speak, that we don't get to vote on. I just struggle with that. And I'd maybe even lump the zoo in there, but I don't know how often. I mean, these aren't big amounts. I'm talking big amounts, $10,000 more. for that. So if that's an option to do for that. And then the other question I had as I was kind of digging into this, and I don't want to sound like an idiot asking this question, but when I was looking at our median sales price and the affordability index, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing as far as that? I know Councilor Staley asked about the units, but we've seen some pretty big changes from 2017 to 2019. I mean, that essentially looks like a V almost, or a sideways L on our graph here as far as, you know, the median price income at 190 in 2017, but the affordability index is at, you know, almost 219. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is it construction prices, or what are you seeing?
So, yes, we included this in the last month's report just to try to give some additional data and perspective on what's going on in the community. We may pull this one and replace it, you know, at points in the future. Yeah. But the one with this one is, and the key points I would take away is, one, you do see the increase of that median price of the home, and that's driven a lot by the affordability. But I think it drives affordability. It's driven in large part by what people are demanding, but also what is viable to construct based on the cost of construction and just the cost of development right now. And so that's just a concerning factor in terms of available affordable housing within the community itself. The affordability index, actually higher number is a positive, and the lower number is you're seeing less affordability. So we do see some improvement in the affordability, and you would say, okay, how is the price going up? And we're seeing improvement in affordability. I believe what's driving it here in these particular late months of this year is the drop in the interest rates. So this is what it would cost based on a certain income amount, based on current market rates for mortgages, to afford the median price home, essentially. I'd go back and give you the exact definition. So the only thing, if you've got median price going up, the only thing that could drive that affordability to be better is higher incomes, which we've seen increase in income, but I wouldn't say jumps in income. But we have seen a significant reduction in mortgage costs. So I think that's driving, it looks affordable, but I don't think that's a continuing trend. We're going to see mortgage rates
Some
probably
changes with it.
up.
Okay. And then one last question that I have, the 6 liquor licenses that were sold, were those all liquor licenses, or were there any variations of restaurant/liquor license?
I am not an expert on liquor licenses.
That's okay.
So these were the 6 additional liquor licenses we received because of the census data.
And they're regular liquor licenses,
estimates.
yeah.
And so they were the full, what I would call the full liquor licenses, the $200,000 liquor licenses.
Okay.
But I can't, I don't know exactly who, there was a wait list for them, and who, you know, there's a order in which they can receive them. So I don't know exactly who the buyers were.
No, but I heard a few partnering with it, and that wait list has caused some, I'll say, drama amongst the industry, because, you know, Joe Blow that wants to open up a bar restaurant maybe doesn't have the funds to put $10,000 down and sit on a wait list until it comes available, but then in turn they have to buy it off market for a substantial amount higher unless they do the restaurant license, which there comes with way more strings attached and it costs more money. And so I just remind my council friends that that's something that I really think we need to consider looking at, because it is an economic driver that, you know, you have a restaurant license, 50% of your sales have to come from food, and the other 50% can come from liquor, but you have to prove those receipts. And if you don't, you lose your liquor license. So for a general restaurant, maybe a chain restaurant, that's probably okay, but maybe for someone who specializes a little bit more, I don't want to use restaurant names, but somebody who specializes in maybe a little more nightlife, so to speak, and is open till that 2 a.m. and doesn't have their kitchen open past 10, they need that liquor license to be able to stay open. But you have a restaurant license and there's so many more strings attached and proof that you need to do, but it costs more money. So is it an economic driver? I don't know, but that's something that I think we really need to take a look at to see if that makes sense for our city or not for that. Because, I mean, just the arcade place, again, I'm not going to use their names, they came in and they got the full liquor license. They didn't want to jump through the hoops of proving their receipts for that 50% food versus liquor. So I understand it's just so much easier to not have to worry about it, but I mean, I just think it's something that we should be encouraging and looking at maybe a little bit closer. Just a thought.
Going back just to your previous comments too, I don't see, we had talked about maybe for the next monthly financial, or maybe it is a separate presentation talking about the status of our entertainment facilities. I think timeliness, it's good. We can talk about the Orpheum management transition, how that's going, which I think there's a positive story to tell there. I will tell you on the receivables that were outstanding, and I appreciate wanting to provide some clarity to some of them because there has been some misinformation just in general on several items related to receivables that are just not correct. So we can provide some clarity for that. I echo your concerns on the subsidy of tenants if they're not paying their bills and if that's allowed to continue going forward. What I would say is, when we transferred the Orpheum over to the Washington Pavilion, we could not carry the receivables. It's different in the way that their management
Gotcha. Nonprofit versus, yeah.
We own the accounts for SMG. We do not own them for the pavilion. It's just a different type of management agreement. So we retain the receivables. We retain them and continue to collect on them through SMG up to the point where they were at them. But there's positive news to say on many of those fronts. The other piece of it, as far as the internal audit, the SMG agreements and the I believe the Washington Pavilion agreement, but I know the SMG agreement and Spectra, those are all in internal audits portfolio for this year for looking at. And so I don't know if their scope of work extends as far as like looking at receivables, but I know they look at quite a few things and I'm sure that they could, add that or it's outside of my purview. So I guess I would leave that to internal audit to decide how far they can take that.
I just want to ensure that we've got something in place so we just don't come back and go, oh, geez, these people owe us $100,000. We better put a policy in place. And I'm not saying that exists today. I just want to make sure it's there because it didn't exist for the landfill and we had to make some big changes with how we operated that. And I know that was prior year time, but it didn't sit well with a lot of us. So I don't know, just a thought. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Right.
Councilor Staley?
Counselor Erickson, what other options do we have with that? I mean, as a municipality, we can change like the parameters of what a restaurant?
Yes, we can.
Really? So, okay.
Because there's a, I believe there, and I don't want to speak out of turn, if I may, Mr. Chair, sorry. There are parameters in which we can set the price, and it's per citizen something. So I don't know the exact. I know just enough to be dangerous. I'm sure somebody much smarter than me knows that. But
I asked Jamie that one time. Yeah, I understand that part, but I didn't know. I mean, can we create something? But we can't say something that says, well, you only have to have a fourth of your receipts in restaurants.
no, that's set by the state. That for 50% is set by the state, but we could adjust the price. So we could make it maybe a little more sexy for them to want to buy.
No, and I'm all with you. I'm with you on that. I think, and what, just, do you know off the top of your head what those licenses cost? Like the liquor restaurant one versus?
I know it's almost 200,
Yeah, but
195 and 260.
260 and 195 approximately.
So the restaurant one is 260?
Right, and it comes
the other
with all
one's-
these strings attached. So you'd think that maybe the full liquor license should cost a little more than, I mean, it just would be a way for those folks that, with the Development Foundation, when they come in and say, hey, you should get that restaurant license and pay another $70,000 to the city. And they're saying, heck no, I'll go on the wait list and maybe I won't come for another 5 years. Well,
No, and as far as creating maybe just an equal playing field, I would be on board. I would, yes, I would say yes, let's do it.
so I think that
Amen,
will be
okay.
something that we'll get together and I'll talk to Councilor Staley and we'll see what we can do. Talking to Jamie, and the attorney's office has been involved with that too. We've kind of had this conversation going for a while, but we really haven't done anything with it, and it's time. I'm tired of waiting, so.
Councilor Neitzer?
Yeah, it's a little off topic, but elaborating on that, we've had that discussion in the past. The other issue you have is just a matter of, you literally have a case where through the liquor licenses that we can issue, people are essentially flipping and making a windfall. And is it appropriate that if we have a new liquor license and you're on the wait list, you can buy it for $190 and sell it the next day for $480,000 or $600,000? So we really probably should be pricing them to the market and then looking to see if there's a way in which we could, I'm not sure if we could, but if there's a way that we can make sure that you're not just getting on the list just because you want to put in the money and just flip it. So there's some philosophical discussions, and it doesn't make sense that you would pay more for a restricted license like a restaurant than a regular liquor license. So discussion we should have, so, thanks.
Anybody else on this one? All right, well, I think you're up again, so this time on this presentation, supplemental appropriation requests to be presented in November for storm damage, storm removal, or snow removal and other, so.
All right, Sean Pritchett again with Finance Department. So I'm going to give you a preview of some of the supplements that are coming forward, that would come forward for first reading on November 5th. They're typically don't always come to informationals to talk about supplements, but we have a lot of supplements that are coming forth at the same time. So I thought it'd be appropriate to take an opportunity to kind of give you a heads up about what some of those are, just kind of a high level review of them. Most of these will deal with public works related items, and so Director Cotter will be here presenting on the first ordinance review on November 5th. But this is just an opportunity to give you a preview of what's to come so you can formulate your questions during that time in between now and then, and hopefully if I have any that I can answer for you today as well. But there are essentially 5 areas, 5 categories that we're looking for supplemental requests that would be coming forward. And I'm going to get into detail, a little bit more detail on each one of these, but we'll kind of walk through those. The first one is related to the storm damage that Councilor Staley had brought up, and this is a request for $1.8 million. This is all through the general fund. The source for the paying for this is from the fund balance with an expectation that some would be reimbursed through FEMA. The second one that affects the general fund is a provisional winter supplement. We had to bring one forward last year as well. This is due to the high number of snow events that we had during the first 5 months of this year. We're making a $3 million request for this, but again, this is a provisional supplement utilized only as needed and up to the amount needed. The next 2 relate to the sales tax fund. They both have actually a net zero impact overall on the available balance for the sales tax fund. So the first one is arterial improvements, and this is based on what we're seeing coming in for platting fees. They're coming in above budget, and similar to last year with the request to give the appropriations authority for the arterial streets portion. The second one relates to several South Dakota DOT projects where it's pass-through money through the city. So we'll receive $2 million for $2 million worth of expenditures that we would have, no net impact there. And then the last one is actually more preparatory from the storm damages or the storm mitigation that we've had, a request to buy 4 pumps that would be utilized within our storm drainage system when addressing these events. And again, the source of that is actually from the storm drainage fund. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail on those and then open it up to any questions that you have. This is just this is our preliminary estimate from the city's expenditures or costs related to the September storm that occurred, the tornado and the flooding that occurred shortly thereafter. So with this, that $2.2 million damages, so that includes regular wages and benefits for $250,000. Now you'll see that our actual request for a supplemental is only $1.8 million. Part of the reason for that is because we already have $250,000 of those wages already in our budget, so these were existing wages. These may not be reimbursed by FEMA, but we incorporated them because it is part of the time that was spent, the actual total cost for the city. So we incorporated the wages and the hours that were dedicated or coded to the time period dealing with that mitigation. Overtime wages can be reimbursed in part from FEMA, and so those are tracked separately. That's a $170,000 expense. The tree removal and repairs portion, that deals with, that includes debris pickup and disposal, sidewalk and curb repairs, stump grinding in the public right-of-way, and tree hangers. The next piece, the street and traffic repairs, that deals primarily with repairs that are necessary and were necessary for the 60th Street Bridge were impacted by the flooding, as well as the traffic signals that went down during the tornado event and were damaged. And finally, various park repairs that include parks such as Harmadon, Yankton Trail, Spencer Park, and Tut Hill. So again, the full accounting right now that we have is for $2.2 million. we will seek reimbursement for what is eligible through that. We can seek up to an 85% reimbursement, similar to the previous disaster event that occurred earlier in the year. But certainly we wouldn't see the full 85% of the 2.2 million reimbursed. It's just going to be dependent upon the amount that will actually be eligible for reimbursement, which is still yet being determined, so it's a little early to make a determination on that. So the request is actually for $1.8 million for the supplement. 1.6 million of that relates to highways and streets, and about 200,000 of that relates to parks. So the difference between the 2.2 million and the 1.8 million is about 400,000. Those differences include that $250,000 in wages, which are already an appropriated item, so they don't require a supplement. 80,000 of overtime in other departments. So these might be overtime hours that occurred within our enterprise funds, not within the general fund. And the enterprise funds are not appropriated. The general fund is. And so it just depends on where their wages happen to be paid from. And then 81,000 in parks projects that are not anticipated to occur in 2019 and will occur in 2020 instead. Now, I will give you the caveat that with the request for this $1.8 million, you know, it is also highly dependent on when we can get the work done for these repairs. We are nearing the end of the year. Weather will be an impact here. These funds cannot be carried forward into the next year, and so we may have to, whatever doesn't get completed within this supplemental, we may have to come back in 2020 and request another appropriation. It's just to reappropriate the funds again because they cannot be carried forward. These are not capital expenses. So early on, we didn't know where we would be, whether these expenses would be treated as capital or not capital, but most all of the damage repairs that we've had are actually hitting the general fund, and that's why you're seeing that there. The second item, of course, is the snow provisional supplement request for $3 million. Currently, we are about 84% expended in our winter operations budget through October, and we expect we will be 100% expended without any additional snow or de-icing events in 2019. Overall, the highway and streets budget is anticipated to be 99% expended through the end of the year. And again, this assumes no actual snow or de-icing events that occur. The reason for the supplemental, and we've been talking about this throughout the summer, that this was going to be a necessary item. The need for additional funding is due to the extraordinary number of events that did occur in the earlier parts of this year. On average, between January and May, we get about 33 inches of snow. During that time period in 2019, we received 40 inches of snow. On average, we have 3 snow alerts during that time period. This year, we had 5 snow alerts during that. And then if you recall, spring 2018 was not a good one for us either. We had a lot of snow and de-icing events. We actually had 17 de-icing events last year in the first 5 months. In 2019, in the first 5 months, we had 25. So unfortunately, we had a challenging situation in 2018 that did not improve into 2019. Now, you know, we don't know exactly how many snow events. I mean, to a certain extent, it would be helpful from a budgetary standpoint anyway, that we didn't have a significant number of snow or de-icing events occurring for the rest of the year. But it's really unknown at this point, and we certainly have had a lot of moisture in the atmosphere. So we'll see how the rest of the year goes, but the request is for the $3 million. And again, the source of that is available balance from the general fund. The thing that I do want to point out, though, is we talked about adding $1 million to reserve, that it does incorporate utilizing a good portion of the provisional request being made here. So it's being offset by the additional revenues we have received in this year. The next set of areas relate to the sales tax fund, and so we had additional fees that came in for platting fees. So right now, we've already received $150,000 more than we anticipated for the full year for 2019 from platting fees. We expect that to be about $250,000 more coming in through the last 3 months of the year. That would allow for an appropriation of $400,000 additional authority for the arterial streets. The second item is, of course, those South Dakota DOT reimbursements. So that is for $2.04 million. You can see a series of projects that are listed there that they are related to. So this is a net neutral, zero impact on the sales tax fund from an available balance standpoint. It's revenue offsetting expenses, just running through the city, but does require appropriation authority from you. And then finally, the $200,000 for the 4 additional pumps. I know that Director Cotter could speak more eloquently to this, but in the last couple of events, we've had to lease pumps, find pumps, get people to lend us pumps. This is to help prepare us for the future events. This is not a reimbursable expense from FEMA. This is a preparatory expense for us, given that we had 2 events this year, that we should be prepared for those that might be coming in the future if we see the same sort of flooding events that occur in the future. With that, I would entertain any questions you have in relation to those supplements. Thank you.
Thank you again. Questions, councilors? Councilor Staley.
Now, I'm going to ask the question about sidewalk and curb repair. Reagan, is he the man? Which sidewalks and curb repairs are we talking about?
Well, part of that figure that Sean gave was the city's letting a contract to go out and do the stump removal, tree root removal, and then curb and gutter repair for those trees that were upended in those areas. And I think at this point we've identified 300 sites.
So, do you know which lady I'm talking about with, over on
I
Hawthorne?
I recall that, but I would really encourage them, if they haven't, their recourse is to work with risk management. They'll investigate, adjudicate, and if the city's got legal liability, they'll take care of that.
So that, because she was told that in times of disaster, the city has no liability. So if they
Well, I guess have her contact me if she hasn't already contacted risk management. I can't believe anybody would have told her that, but.
Okay, yes, I will. Thank you so much for that. And then I got another question for Sean. I know with the sandbagging, because some of us helped with that, and what is it, Rebicon, this company, Rebicon, but we had to keep track of our hours as volunteers at that time, and I kind of heard that they were doing that during the tornado cleanup as well. So how does us keeping track of volunteer hours play out in the FEMA reimbursement?
I'm probably going to defer this to Reagan.
Oh, okay, Reagan.
Be the better one to answer it.
Yeah, that is part of our protocol, and what we do is if we do get awarded a federal declaration, the city can use those hours as part of our soft match, as far as our 15%. As Sean said, FEMA pays 75%, state pays 10%, and then the city assumes 15% of those eligible costs. So they assign, if we can track those volunteer hours, and it's not just volunteer hours, it's if there's donated resources and supplies, which happened in both these scenarios we had this year, we can use that as a soft match against the total cost of the disaster.
So you're getting reimbursed for what we're doing as volunteers?
Yes, the city and the resident of the cities are definitely getting.
And that's where, I think that's where some of the concern came from in the midst of that, when that was first emerging as that disaster, because people were needing help, and some people were being turned away from the help, but some city resources were being used to help people. There was such a inconsistency as to what was being done for homeowners. And so then when we talk about volunteer hours being compensated for, it comes back into the pool of money the city has. So I'm saying I would like to see our policy moving forward be, if we have a disaster like that, again, that we have a standard that we say we are going to remove the trees for the citizens.
The city does have a very comprehensive debris management plan. We had a team.
Well, except
and hear me out. There's, depending on the scenario, the scope of the incident, the public safety factors, those type of things. There are different strategies when it comes to debris management, and some of those are city resources, contracted resources, or residents and volunteers. That's all laid out in that plan, depending on the scope of the incident.
But the map that was put out, and there were two different maps that were put out with the sidewalk as the divisional marking, and that, you know, your tree trunk, if your tree went over here, we're not going to help you, but if it's over here, we will help you, and then you can call for a volunteer, maybe it'll help you, maybe it won't. It just, I heard from constituents that there was an inconsistency. And so now if we're talking about FEMA reimbursement, to me, moving forward, it just means that our city, I'd like to see us even have more of a generosity approach to helping the people if this would ever, God forbid, happen again. That we, knowing that we're going to be compensated for our time and effort. So let's err on the side of giving people even more help than less. That's just my 2 cents.
We'll take that into consideration. Thank you. Any other questions?
Sometimes I can't help myself, and I just will say, during these last 2 storms, I personally have seen more generosity from this administration and this city, as well as the constituents. And I will tell you, when you band together like this city did during the last 2 storms, from flooding and from the tornado, the stories that came out of people from helping, and random people just stopping on the road saying, I've got a truck, let's load it up, let's do it, I've got chainsaws. I couldn't scroll through my social media without going, more people working, look at all these people I mean, it was awesome. It was such a good feeling to say, I'm from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We got that storm cleaned up, and I say we collectively as a city, the constituents, the citizens, the administration, everyone was out there busting some tail, getting stuff done. And so for me personally, I've never seen anything more generous than that. And when you do it together and do it with some blood, sweat, and tears involved, you have a little bit more pride of ownership in it versus saying, hey, Regan, send a truck and come fix my property. I don't want government to solve all the problems. That's not how government works best. But if we can work together and we can solve those problems together, I mean, the emails that I got for generosity, I kept forwarding them on to the administration, and I hope you got them as well. Through that, it was awesome. And so while we talk about reimbursement and how we can continue to give back, I just encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. The messaging maybe could have been a little bit more clear, because there certainly was a little misunderstanding on how stuff works. But just the other day, I pulled up and I saw on Western area, they were fixing the curb and pulling those trees up that knocks down signs. And, you know, still, it takes time. We still are going to see the aftermath of these storms for months and weeks to come, unfortunately, because insurance takes forever, and that's just the way the process works. But I'm proud to be from here, and the generosity that came forward was amazing. So I just want to say thank you for what you and your team did.
Okay. Counselor, anybody else? Counselor Neitzer.
Not a question. I just wanted to make sure to point out that since it was talked about the stump removal, I was at the bid letting, which was, I don't remember if it was a week or 2 ago. It's been a blur. But what was really cool is that our engineers, we sent people out and they took pictures of all of the different damages around the city, and they have GPS coordinates, and then GIS actually built a map and they provided it to the bidders where they could go in and they could click on each one and you'd see a picture of the damage, and it showed where it was, and it even had like what utilities were there, and it gave the bidders more visibility into what exactly they were bidding on. And so you could see all the locations on the map. And because of that, we got multiple favorable bids. I think it came in under bid. It was like $400,000. And something that I did want to lift up as well is that it was removal of, and this was like I said, there was like 300 locations, removal of stumps, and you saw sidewalks that had been upheaved or broken, and you had curbs that were broken and boulevards that were broken, and of course utilities potentially wrapped in there. And the city is, we bid that, and we're replacing all of that at our cost. The homeowners aren't being assessed for any of that, even though technically you could say that they have to replace the sidewalk. So we're doing that all at our cost, and I believe it has to be done by the end of November, if I remember right. I think that was a requirement, which is pretty aggressive.
It is. Well, knock on wood.
Yeah, so.
Weather permitting.
And they're at it, I think, so. Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right. Well, I would just maybe reiterate just one quick comment of Councilor Erickson's, just to say well done to you and your team. Thank you. We will move on. Professional service agreements for bond and public safety. Chief Goodroad and Tom Huber. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Tom Huber with the Finance Office. Probably thinking we let Finance take the whole agenda and they'll never sit down. But we want to take a few minutes today just to highlight a couple of agreements that will be coming forward here in hopefully the next week, on your agenda next week, but for sure in the next couple weeks, regarding the bond issuance that's coming up in 2020. A quick refresher, the 2020 budget and the 2020 through 2024 capital improvement program does include debt service for a new bond issue. This slide is taken from Sean's presentation during the budget process. At the time, Sean briefed you that in addition to the three new projects, the Public Safety Training Facility, Fire Station Number 12, and the River Greenway, the bond proposal would likely include a current refunding of at least one existing bond. That's the 2009A Quality of Life 2 bonds that built some park and library projects. Since then, with the rates taking although they've recovered some, have taken a fairly significant run to the downside, we've added the 2009B flood control bonds to the potential mix on the refunding side, depending on where rates are when we actually issue the bonds this spring, those bonds may be in play. Some of those bonds were issued as taxable bonds. They're part of the recovery zone bonds, which the city gets a federal rebate on those. So rates have to be lower than some of the rates on the 2009A bonds, and some of the 2009Bs were issued as a tax-exempt series as well. So rates need to be lower on the taxable side for those to come into play, but we'll see when we get there where rates are and if those come into play to be refunded as well. The timing of the projects and the 2009, both series of 2009 bonds being eligible for current refunding allows the city to take advantage of completing one bond issue to cover both new projects and the current refundings. It's certainly an efficient use of resources to get the best rate possible, reduce costs, and one thing that often gets overlooked is the factor that each bond issue has to have its own reserve fund that gets set aside. And that just ties up resources. By combining into one, you free up those reserves. You don't have to have multiple reserve funds setting aside. You put more of your current resources to work. So why are we here today? As kind of the next steps, as project design work continues for each of these projects, the current plan is to bring the bond ordinance forward for council review and action as early as February or March this year. In order to do so, we need to engage the city's project financing partners, which consist of a financial advisor and bond counsel. In addition, the city also needs to further engage the current project architect on the public safety training facility to complete schematic design and provide us with final cost estimates on that project. Design on the other two projects, the fire station and the River Greenway, are well underway as well. So on the financial services side, the city's bond counsel and financial advisor obviously play key roles both before the bonds are issued and after the bonds are issued. A quick outline of their roles, as you can see on the slide, bond counsel is obviously crucial to ensuring that the bonds and tax structure are appropriate. They do issue the legal opinion for the bonds. They prepare the bond ordinance and the trust indenture that goes with it. And they play an important role in compliance and continuing disclosures after the bonds have been issued. The city's financial advisor also participates in the bond and tax structure, but advises on all financial aspects of the issuance, from the term of the issuance, the debt service projections, debt coverage ratios, market conditions, and the like that goes into financing strategy. They also prepare the offering or the official statement that goes with these, and markets and completes the bond sale process. Both of these services were competitively bid out when we issued the event center bonds. So at that time, they were competitively bid, and these two firms that we're going to talk about next, PFM on the financial advisor side, and Perkins Coie, Bruce Bonjour on the bond counsel side. So on the financial advisor side, PFM is our current financial advisor. No action is needed on this agreement. We did want to brief it though, just so you have familiarity with it. It's been a while, as the agreement does run through November 30th of 2020. PFM is a financial advisory, asset management and consulting firm out of Minneapolis. Their fee is comprised of a base fee plus a fee per thousand in bonds sold. And you can see, depending upon if you're less or greater than 50 million, what that fee is up to, 47,500 if it's less than 50 million, if you issued all 50 million, which would include the base fee of 25,000 plus 45 cents per thousand bonds sold. If it's greater than a $50 million issue and less than a $100 million issue, which certainly is not going to reach this in this bond issue case, but would be up to 72,500, which is a base fee of 47,500 plus 25 cents per 1,000 bonds sold. They also prepare the official statement. It's $5,000 for those, and they have established project rates, although we've used them on several occasions for minor projects here and there, and I'm not sure that we've ever been billed on a project rate basis. They just do that. Nothing extensive, but from time to time, we do ask for some advice. And lastly, they get paid out-of-pocket expenses. On the bond counsel side, as I mentioned, Bruce Bonjour with Perkins Coie out of Chicago has been the city's bond counsel on several issues, beginning with the event center bonds. This item would be coming forward as an agreement on the consent agenda. We're hoping to get it on the November 5th agreement, or on the November 5th agenda, but we still need to receive an actual signed copy back from Perkins Coie. Terms of the bond are similar to what we've had in previous issues. In this case, it's $45,000 for the new project bonds, if we do it in one issuance, and then for each series of the refunded bonds, would be $5,000 per series. There is additional tax and work to be done that goes into a current refunding of bonds that they will need to perform. In addition, they have in their agreement outlined $5,000 for work towards the bond rating upgrade that we've talked about, and then any out-of-pocket expenses. If for some reason the bond issue was split and we did two issues, there would be an additional $25,000 for a second issue. There's a whole other set of documents that needs to be prepared, and you need to run through the whole process basically again. Bruce is no stranger to South Dakota. He also provides bond counsel services to the state revolving fund program that we participate in, as well as the South Dakota Housing Authority. Again, this agreement would be coming forward for your approval on an upcoming agenda. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brad on the WSKF contract and be available to answer any questions.
Good afternoon, councilors. Fire Chief Brad Goodrow here today to talk about WSKF contract. So you'll see the WSKF professional services contract for 100% schematic design on your consent agenda for the November 5th meeting. WSKF with Tommy Abercrombie as the lead architect will determine the final space requirements and overall campus site plan. Tommy and his team will bring a worldwide design and construction management experience to these unique and complex training structures that's listed on this slide. This firm provided our Public Safety Training Center needs assessment study, and we continue to follow those recommendations. So we've negotiated a good, fair price structure for these services. The cost for Phase 1 schematic design service will be just over $369,000, which will be funded through our existing budget for design work and not part of the bond financing. We are planning for a 120-day completion of these services. Here you'll see a further breakdown of the services provided in this contract. The design team will take all input up to this point, and through direct communications with city teams will further define the exact plan of this facility. The design services will also include the final cost estimates to determine overall cost of the campus as well as individual components. So happy to answer any questions at this time.
All right, councilors, do you have any questions? Councilor Neitzer?
Is there potentially some sort of a police, I don't know if you call it a racetrack or something like that, contemplated?
Yeah, so that's the EVOT course. We have a slow speed, and you'll see in the design there's a slow speed EVOT course for fire, and then police has a larger, higher speed course. So they'll determine what the cost of that is, and that'll be one of the components that they'll design in the schematic.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Anybody else? Councilor Erickson?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I know I've been super critical on not the project itself, but on some of the bonding components, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to help me understand really the process and some of the cost savings that we will enjoy with doing it this route. I think it's certainly an exciting time as we talk about the public safety training facility and the needs of our community as we continue to grow and the challenges that we have. One of the statements was made that one of these items was going to be on consent. For me, I just strongly encourage, just because it can go on consent, it's such an important project for us to talk about. Put it on the regular agenda if you can. I just feel passionate about that some things make sense for this. This is just something that we're not going to do every 5 years, 10 years, 20 years even, that let's just put it on the regular agenda for that. And then people can chime in. We can have some public input on it as well. That's all I'll say. Thanks.
Councilor Staley?
So Chief Goodroad, what is the cost going to be for the new training facility?
Well, that's what this schematic design does, is finalize those costs. So they've given us, an estimate early on when they did their consulting in that 20 to 30 million for all these components. Now, as they do the schematic design, then they'll firm up those costs. So by the end of that 120-day time frame, we'll have those costs firmed up.
So it won't go over 30 million? Or could it go over 30 million? I mean,
so when they do these, the consulting of this, they look at that range, and they're confident that it's within that range. But as construction costs change, things change, your climate, that's what they'll do now, is they'll firm up those costs. So they'll get, instead of just a broad design of, okay, this is the type of building that you're going to need for your classroom, they'll look at our needs, they'll reassess that. They'll spend a lot of time working with us on, and then really firm up the exact size of that structure. Once they firm up exactly what that is, then they can further firm up those costs.
would it ever happen that a city would say, we want to spend, let's say, 25 million? So that's our limit. What can you give us? What can we get for 25 million? Does it ever work that way? Versus, because it sounds like we're kind of leaving it open-ended for them to tell us the figure.
Right. So we'll look at, when they do this schematic design, they'll do it 100%. Each component will have a dollar figure. And then if there's, let's say we're at 25 million, then we'll look at some of those components, and if it's a little bit over that, then we'll say, okay, what's a priority? What can we change? What can we adjust to meet that number?
But if it came in, let's just say it comes back at 45 million, is that a possibility?
I don't think that's a possibility at that.
Why wouldn't that be a possibility? I mean, did someone say at some point you get 30 million to work with? Or, I mean, who set those parameters of what it's going to cost?
So this firm did a study on our needs, and in doing that study, they looked at some of these components, and they look at them generally. This is the general size of what that might be and what that might look like. And then they looked at cost of construction at the time, but they don't dive as deep into that because it's just a study and with general plans. Now this brings it into a schematic design, so you'll know the square footage of everything, the elevation, you'll know what the civil work needs to be done, and then that really allows you to then firm up that cost exactly.
It, just for my knowledge, like when you're building a new fire station, is this how you do that as well? You had the same process of you're letting someone else look at it and tell you what it's going to cost? Or?
Right, so with our fire stations, we look at what we've done in the past. We look at some of the changes that, lessons learned on a facility, make those adjustments. We know pretty close to what that same footprint's going to be, and then they go through the same process. They do a design process to firm it up. I mean, they can give an estimate, but until they do the schematic design and really set, okay, these are the exact number of square feet, this is where the doors are going to go, this is the type of siding that it's going to have, this is the type of roof it's going to have, then you start to really firm that cost up to exactly what it's going to be.
Exactly. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And if I could just make a statement.
You may.
Just thank you. Sean Pritchard said earlier when he was speaking to us that he's giving us a heads up about, well, we're getting a public heads up. You're doing as well, Chief Goodroad. You're giving us a heads up of what's coming down the road, right? That's what's happened today at this informational. We've had great conversation from Councilor Neisert, Councilor Erickson, Starr. We've had a nice dialogue. It's been very helpful for us. The time is 25 to 6. If this meeting, if we changed our meeting, if that was implemented, we would have had to quit about 20 minutes ago, because we would have had to allow time for public input. We would be having our meeting starting in 25 minutes. We wouldn't have time to eat, and we have an executive session left to have. So just so, and I don't think we've wasted any time. I think it's been very beneficial. I wouldn't give 1 ounce of this time up. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Councilor Starr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my questions are for Tom, if we could, more than anything. Thank you, Chief, though. So back on slide 2, when we start adding this up, because I'm a total numbers kind of guy. So the public safety training facility is 20 to 30 million. The fire station number 12 is going to be 3 million, because I think that's what we had in the CIP at least.
3.25, somewhere
3.25. Yeah, what's a couple $100,000 among friends, right? The River Greenway, we've heard different numbers. Give me a range of what we're thinking for the River Greenway, or where are we in the design process for that? Didn't we put some of that money in the CIP too?
Right, we are in the design process with that. I think the last time during the budget presentation, Sean talked about, 7 to 10 million in that range is what was being looked at. But again, that's still in the preliminary design process.
And then the quality of life bonds too, the A series is how much to refinance? Just roughly.
Roughly about right in that 10 million range. You've got 11.8 million after we make this year's debt service payment here in November. That will be outstanding, but there's also 1.6 million reserve that would be freed up. So it's going to be in that 10 range.
And then the B series, roughly?
The B series would have just under 20 million outstanding if you went with both portions. After the 2.7 million reserve, you're looking at about 17 million in that range somewhere. But again, the debt service for those is already in the plan, is already planned, and you're just going to end up with savings on those, not more debt service than you're already paying, or you wouldn't refund them.
Right, it wouldn't make sense. Those are 20-year bonds, so they'd mature in 2029 if we didn't do anything?
The quality of life 2s, the 2009 A's would go through 2028 currently, and the flood control bonds, the tax exempt portion runs off in 2023, the taxable portion that has that federal rebate on it 2029. So inside of 10 years on both of those.
And sorry, I feel like 20 questions. I apologize. I just rapid fire sometimes. What are we looking at just roughly interest rates then on the two of them? Or it would actually be 3 different numbers, wouldn't it? Because there's the taxable ones and the non-taxable on the... Yeah,
and each one of those has different rates. The coupons are different on those, and...
just who we sold them to, because they're
correct. It's how you package them together, and generally rates go up over time, but some of them bought them with premiums, so they bought the rates rates up some, so some of those actually went down over time. So it's kind of an up and down on them. So, and what rates we get, it depends on what the market's like in February, or, if we pass the bond ordinance in February and March, you're selling in probably May, in that May timeframe. So what rates are like at that time.
We'll have a better idea after we get past the first of the year. Plus, we get through some of the design and what we actually need for money for the bigger projects.
I mean, sky's not the limit, but, because we do have debt service programmed in there, but we do want to let schematic design take place on these projects before we start hammering final numbers down.
Makes sense. Remind me again how you explained the bond, the financial advisor, we already have an agreement in place that we put in place as part of the event center.
It came after that. The formal competitive bid was done during the event center, but then we did more of an informal bid process again on that. And at that point, we would have entered into a 5-year agreement with them. It goes through.
Gotcha. But then when we go to bond council, we don't have do we normally just have kind of a rolling agreement in place for bond council, or is it a project?
Those are kind of specific to each issue, because depending on the tax complexity, are you talking taxable, are you talking tax exempt, are you refunding, are you doing projects, and the kind of level on those. Some projects have private activities associated with them, like the event center and the parking ramp. So you're talking about, you have to do various testing. So it's kind of bond specific for the bond council. So we do those. We don't go out for RFPs every time. You don't want to switch too often, but
professional services.
From time to time you do, and then you retain them for a while, and the price is set based on the type of issue.
I'm trying to remember the two different kinds of bonds. So these will be competitively sold, or will the issuer get to sell them?
The last several issues we've done on a competitive market. There are occasions that you do consider negotiated type sales when the markets are swinging widely and you need to lock certain things in, or the market environment is just right. But in general, we found it to the best interest of the city to sell the bonds on a competitive market. We have a good bond rating. We hope to improve that bond rating. Also, we do some work on that in this process to give it a shot, and so our bonds do sell well competitively.
That's it for my rapid fire. Thank you.
It's good. Thank you.
Councilor Neitzer.
Continuing on the refunding or refinancing, and that some terminology people would like to use, will those be really dependent on market conditions? It's going to be kind of more of a game time decision?
Right. Most likely, I would say that both tax exempts will be easily in play. It'll be the taxable portion of the 2009B bonds that will kind of be at the time. You got to factor in what does freeing up that reserve do, some of the compliance stuff that we do on these bonds versus, where the rates are. And if they're low enough, even on a rate-only basis, it can be advantageous to, current refund those. And by current refunding, all of these can be repaid without penalty. They have call dates on them. They've met their 10-year call date, so they're fully eligible to be called without any penalty to the city. That remains to be seen what those rates are and that federal rebate, how that all plays together.
And then when you're looking at trying to make this decision, are you making a determination on, I guess, what I would call either a cash flow basis or just in totality of savings, meaning that, if we have 6 or 7 years left on these and you refi them for maybe 20 years, maybe you drop your payment on a cash flow basis, but over the years you're going to end up paying more potentially. What's your goal here?
Refinancing, we have that debt service plugged in. We're not going to try to, depending on what the market's like, again, there's all kinds of forces that come into play on this, but generally you don't try to extend them. We've usually shortened the time frame on most of our current refundings. And so how it all plays together remains to be seen, but like on the Lewis and Clark bonds and the Quality of Life 1 bonds that we refunded, we were able to achieve lower interest rates and shorten the time frame. And so it's,
Okay,
the market's that point.
well, maybe you can clarify for me, because the public service, I don't know what number you're thinking, but it could be anywhere, 15, 20 years or something like that. I don't know if that's another piece
For
that
the
you have to
public,
figure out.
for the
Public
new
safety,
project bonds,
yeah.
yeah, generally those would be looking at in that 20-year time frame. Although we've brought them down depending upon, how the debt service factors in, what rates are like. We try not to extend our time frame on paying off our obligations any longer than we have to. Take advantage of the rates and pay them down as fast as possible to reduce interest costs.
Okay, so clarify for me. So if that's going to be 15, 20 years, give or, depending on, what we can do. For the refunding wouldn't have the same exact structure of, it's not just bundled into one bond or loan, or can it have a different term? The ones we're refunding, could they be 5-year?
They'll probably all get bundled into one bond more than likely, but they'll keep very specific schedules on probably each part of it, on the rundown on it, to make sure that we can highlight out what the savings are for each of those issues. So we're going to want to see the full analysis of what each of the current refundings, how much savings there are from those, and the cost on the new project bonds. So, but it will all be bundled into one. That will be split out by our advisor internally. But most likely, you can do series, but again, we'll have to see what's most advantageous at the time. You just start running into costs and.
Yeah, I guess so. So it just, I guess I was still trying to get to. So if I'm looking at the bonds that expire or paid off in 29, 28, you're.
Well, the ones that are paid off.
If they're paying off in 10 years and then you're refining them for 20 years.
Yeah,
Or we not
you'll
doing that, so.
accelerate the payments. So your payments on the front end of the bonds for the first 10 years of these, or less than 10 years, will be higher than your payments on the later end of it, to account for that.
Okay, so
Yeah,
you're
we're not trying to extend the existing bonds out further.
You would
We're
be
just trying to get a
structuring
better
them.
rate.
Got it. So you'd be structuring it so they would essentially, that piece would be
Correct.
paid off in
Right.
about the same time frame.
Yep.
You're
I'm
not
sorry,
stretching.
trying to
No,
be clear on it, but-
that's helping. I'm just trying to, I'm just equating it to, for example, if I have a 15-year mortgage and I refi it to a 30, and I just, that's not necessarily a good thing.
Most likely you will not see a level payment for 20 years. You're going to see some bumps in there as we take these refunded bonds out.
Okay.
We already have the debt service programmed in there, and are going to want to, like I said, keep them, in reasonable terms to what they were.
So the payments on the front, it'll be front-loaded, or it could be higher and then it will drop.
Front-loaded, unless, I guess the change-up could be, depends on where interest rates are. You might shift some out if interest rates are really advanced, if the yield curve is flipped around, but we have to, let's see what it's like at the time.
Great, thank you.
And
Councilor
there's
Erickson?
more qualified people than me that can speak to that.
Okay, that helps. Anybody else? Make a motion here. All right, I think we're good. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we will move on to public comment section on anything that we talked about today. If anybody has anything to say. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I will make a motion to enter executive session for the reason of consulting with legal counsel or reviewing communications from legal counsel about proposed or pending litigation or contractual matters pursuant to SDCL 1-25-2, parent 3.
Second, Nitzert?
Okay, roll call vote.
Council members Erickson,
Yes.
Nitzert,
Yes.
Selberg,
Yes.
Starr,
Yes.
Okay, we will move into executive session. Thank you.
Quorum to go into